A meeting in Delhi of the G20 group of leading nations has ended in disagreement over the war in Ukraine. India's foreign minister says differences on the invasion could not be reconciled. Despite their opposing stances, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian opposite number, Sergei Lavrov, met for the first time since the war began.
A gathering of leaders beset by division. As host of the G20 foreign ministers meeting, India was determined to focus attention beyond the war in Ukraine. But despite their best efforts, the conflict quickly dominated the agenda. For the first time since the war began, the US and Russian top diplomats spoke face-to-face on the sidelines of the summit.
I told the foreign minister what I and so many others said last week at the United Nations and what so many G20 foreign ministers said today. End this war of aggression. Engage in meaningful diplomacy that can produce a just and durable peace.
But the brief exchange did little to narrow the divide between them. Instead, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused Western nations of turning the G20 into a farce. After hours of negotiation, ministers from 20 of the world's wealthiest nations were unable to agree on a joint declaration.
There were differences on the Ukraine issue which we could not reconcile between various parties who held differing positions.
The final declaration had called for Russia's complete withdrawal from Ukraine, a passage that Moscow rejected. But they were not alone. China also objected to the statement, raising concerns in the West that the two nations are moving closer together. Ukraine and its Western allies fear that China may be considering providing weapons to Russia, and Beijing's decision to side with Moscow at the G20 has only reinforced that concern.
And we can now speak to Michael Beckley, who is an associate professor of political science at Tufts University and author of a number of publications on China's position in global politics. Now, can you tell us more about what looks like a developing Russia-China alliance?
Well, that alliance was announced more than a year ago as a no-limits partnership, and now it looks like Beijing is starting to back up its rhetoric with actual material support. There's been reports showing that China has been sending critical components to Russia. This is things like navigation systems, parts for fighter aircraft, and computer chips. And now there's, of course, credible intelligence suggesting China's considering sending lethal aid. So this is very much an alliance. China seems to be backing Russia in increasing ways, and obviously the West, the United States and its allies, are increasingly united in supporting Ukraine.
Who has more to gain from this partnership, Russia or China?
Well, Russia certainly does, just given its precarious position. Russia really has few allies left, and so it needs China as a source of revenue, to sell oil and natural gas to, and now increasingly for resupply of all different types of things, most critically computer chips, just given that Russia has been cut off from those and needs it not only to power its economy, but also to keep its war machine alive and kicking. So China has been a critical conduit, and China also has been running useful interference for Russia by sort of touting Russian propaganda, spreading it not just within China, but across the developing world where China has great influence. So clearly Russia is benefiting more right now, but that doesn't mean that Russia is not important to China. Russia is also very important for Chinese interests.
Yeah, what are the Chinese interests here?
Well, I think first and foremost, if China cannot allow Russia to go down in a humiliating and catastrophic defeat, because that might destabilize Russia itself, and then China would have to deal with a destabilized Russia right on its borders. China also needs to make a good show of supporting its ally, given that it's put its credibility on the line by announcing that no limits partnership. And also Russia, helps China accomplish its broader goal of pushing back against the liberal world order and trying to push forward a more autocratic, hierarchical vision of world order based on state sovereignty. So there's a number of interests here. And also, of course, Russia can supply China with vital commodities, food, as well as oil and gas.
So how much do you think would China want to risk losing in order to keep up its support for Russia?
Yeah, I think right now China's trying to have it both ways. This is why they put forward that peace proposal, the 12-point peace proposal that basically would have ratified Russian gains. They want to show that they're a good global citizen so they can maybe maintain trade ties, especially with the European Union, while at the same time behind the scenes creating facts on the ground. I think China, though, if Russia looks like it's going to go down to defeat, China would be willing to up its support for Russia, even at the cost of diplomatic and economic links with the West. I don't know if China would be willing to sacrifice real blood and treasure, though, to actually get militarily involved. I'm very skeptical of that. But in terms of upping support to the level of lethal aid, I think it's certainly not out of the question, given that China has this overriding interest in keeping Russia standing.
Do you think this is a real long-term partnership, or is China just being pragmatic here?
I think it is a long-term partnership because China doesn't have a lot of allies in the world either. And Russia is really its only major great power ally. And so, you have North Korea, you have Pakistan, you have Venezuela, but, this really is the core of a broader autocratic coalition that includes countries like Belarus and Iran as well. And so I think that China is hoping that this will be a sustainable partnership. China might be fine with a weakened Russia that's more dependent on China, but not a Russia that is flailing and possibly suffering not just military defeat, but internal instability as a result of that defeat.
Michael Beckley there from Tufts University. Thank you very much for that analysis. Now, the invasion of Ukraine a year ago prompted a dramatic U-turn in Germany's defense policy. Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a sharp rise in spending on the armed forces. Now, Scholz has told Parliament what he believes has been achieved and what still needs to be done.
It's been 1 year since Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced what he called the Zeitenwende, a turning point for Germany. Scholz's government committed to significantly increasing funding for German defense and started sending heavy weapons to Ukraine, including state-of-the-art tanks. Taking stock a year after that pivotal speech, Scholz made clear Germany will continue supporting Ukraine's defense. Wanting peace does not mean submitting to a bigger neighbor. If Ukraine stopped defending itself, it would not be peace, but the end of Ukraine. But he said Germany needs to increase the capabilities of its own army, also by upping the production and purchase of weapons and ammunition. Defense Minister Pistorius and I are talking to the defense industry about a real change of track towards rapid, planning-oriented and efficient procurement of defense equipment for the Bundeswehr and other European armies. The opposition says progress is too slow. You quite rightly mentioned cooperation with the arms industry and with European partners. But why were weapons orders, why were decisions not already made in the last year? Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann is chair of the Defense Committee and a member of the governing coalition. She says much has been achieved in the last year, but there is still room for improvement.
We are still not fast enough. We have to become faster. On the one hand, because of the war in Ukraine, but also because we have an obligation towards NATO. And that means more equipment, more personnel.
Such a shift in Germany's defense and security policy was almost unthinkable before Russia invaded Ukraine. But more work remains for the German government to truly make good on its promises.
Well, Germany's Chancellor also had a message for China in his address to the Bundestag earlier today. DW's chief political correspondent Nina Hase was listening in.
Well, Olaf Scholz sees China as the main player, one of the main players, together with India perhaps, in this conflict because, as Olaf Scholz keeps pointing out, this is not just about Russia versus Ukraine. This is about an aggressor challenging the international orders, the international treaties, violating everything that the world order stands on, which is why he says he needs the support from other countries around the world. And he reiterated again how important it was that last week in New York, the United Nations in the General Assembly passed a vote with overwhelming support of the message, essentially, Russia has to stop this war. This is to condemn. These actions are not acceptable. So in his message today, Olaf Scholz spoke about China's message from last year where they warned against nuclear escalation. Olaf Scholz celebrated that at the time as one of his big diplomatic successes because he traveled to Beijing and Xi Jinping stood next to him when he uttered those words, saying nuclear escalation is something that we're strongly warning against. And China still has not officially condemned Russia's war and has not used its influence enough, says the German Chancellor. He also referred to that peace plan that China put forward last week, where China warned against the use of nuclear but also biological and chemical weapons. So there is a very clear signal coming out of Germany here today that China should do more to stop this war from expanding and from letting an aggressor get away with these actions.